What would you do if after years of living quietly and doing the right thing, you were finally given a once-in-a-lifetime chance, only to face a choice between that dream and a complete stranger? Claire Jensen had spent her entire career booking first-class flights for other people, but never once experienced it herself. Until that one fateful day on a flight to Sydney. A simple offer, a face marked by scars, and a quiet decision that 3 weeks later, when the presidential helicopter landed behind her house, made Claire realize. Kindness, no matter how small, can travel farther than we ever imagine. For 6 years at Elysian Travel, Claire Jensen had helped others live out the dreams she could barely afford to imagine for herself. Every day she sat at her modest desk in the corner of the office, booking luxurious getaways to villas in Santorini, honeymoon cruises around Monaco, or first-class flights to anywhere warm and far away. Would you prefer the overwater suite in the Maldives or the penthouse at the Ritz-Carlton? Claire would ask with a soft, professional tone, even as she quietly planned her own next vacation, likely another weekend at her mom's aging timeshare in Florida. The irony was everywhere. She could describe the feel of Egyptian cotton sheets at Capella, Singapore, in perfect detail, yet had never once touched them herself. Each time her colleague Jenna asked, "Don't you ever feel a little resentful?" Claire would smile and say, "I like seeing people happy. It almost feels like I'm living it through them." Her desk was covered with postcards from past clients, couples embracing on cliffside balconies, families smiling on beaches she had handpicked. She wasn't the top seller at Elysian Travel because of charm or pressure tactics. She had something far rarer: trust. "She's the architect of dreams she'll never live," Mr. Bradford, her manager, once said quietly, watching Claire explain the difference between two similar resorts with the care of someone solving a puzzle that mattered. Claire lived simply. No big friend groups, no elaborate plans. Her joy came from matching others with the perfect moment, when everything clicked and memories were made. When her younger sister Emily announced she'd be getting married in Sydney, Australia, Claire didn't hesitate. Even if it meant draining the modest savings she'd slowly built over 4 years, she would be there. What she didn't expect was what happened the day before her flight. As she packed up for the day, her coworkers called her into the break room. "We've been pooling our frequent flyer miles and staff discounts in secret," Jenna said, beaming. "Claire, your economy seat has been upgraded to first class." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. "You're serious?" "No one deserves this more than you," Jenna added, wrapping her in a hug. Claire was overwhelmed. This wasn't just a flight. For someone who had spent a career crafting other people's dream trips, it was a symbol, a rare moment where she was the one being seen, valued, lifted up. All week, she lived in a state of breathless excitement. She read every review about the airline's first-class service, memorized the menu, even practiced polite phrases she might say to the attendants. "You sound more excited about the flight than my wedding," Emily teased over the phone. "Can you blame me?" Claire laughed. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience for someone like me." The morning of her flight, Claire arrived at the airport 3 hours early, too excited to sit at home. She wore a simple but well-put-together outfit, nothing flashy, but carefully chosen so she wouldn't feel out of place among the business travelers and diplomats who usually occupied those seats. But no amount of planning could prepare her for what she saw at the gate. A man was sitting alone near the window, his presence both quiet and deeply striking. The right side of his face bore heavy burn scars, skin pulled tight in uneven lines, features locked in a permanent grimace. His hands were similarly damaged, fingers bent and stiff as he clutched his small carry-on. Claire watched as people gave him a wide berth. A mother quietly moved her children away. A businessman nearly sat next to him but stopped short, suddenly remembering a phone call. The man noticed, of course. How could he not? But his face didn't react. He just stared out the window, alone in a crowded room. Claire recognized that look. It was the same expression her father had worn after a stroke left one side of his face paralyzed, a quiet mixture of dignity and resignation. Her father called it his invisible man look, the practiced pretense of not seeing how people stared or avoided sitting near him. Then a flight attendant approached the burned man to check his boarding pass. She remained professional, But Claire noticed the difference, the distance, the slight lean away. She pointed to the gate, never touching the ticket or the man. Claire's heart tightened. She had arranged countless accommodations for clients with medical needs. She had always assumed dignity was a given. But here, right in front of her, was proof that it wasn't. Flight 722 to Sydney, now boarding first class and priority passengers, the gate agent called. Claire stood, heart racing. This was the moment she'd been dreaming of. The beginning of her once-in-a-lifetime experience. She stepped forward and noticed the man struggling with his bag. His damaged fingers had dropped a small toiletry case, its contents now scattered across the terminal floor. People walked around him, eyes averted. Nobody helped. Claire stopped. She knelt beside him and quietly began collecting his things. "Thank you," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. She handed him his boarding pass, and as a habit of her profession, her eyes flicked to the seat assignment. 38D. Middle seat. Coach. Back row. 14-hour flight. Claire felt her fingers close slightly around her own ticket. 2A. First class. Lie flat bed, glass of wine, gourmet meal, quiet, space. Her coworkers had given her this. She had planned this for weeks. She had saved for this dress. This wasn't just a seat. It was a symbol of something she thought she'd never get. And yet, she looked at the man, at the scars, at the silence, and she remembered her father. The small kindnesses that made him feel human again. She hadn't planned this, but somehow it felt inevitable. Claire stood at the edge of her moment. Her gift, her once-in-a-lifetime window into a world she had only built for others. But now, standing in front of a man scarred by something unimaginable, her fingers clutched a boarding pass that suddenly felt heavier than paper had any right to be. She could feel the friction within herself. The gratitude to her coworkers who had made this possible, the weeks of anticipation, the outfit she had bought so she wouldn't feel out of place. And yet, beside her, a man was bracing for a 14-hour journey in the last row of coach, trapped between strangers, scar against skin, no way to disappear. She looked at his hands, bent, slow, struggling with something as simple as a zipper. And she thought of the strangers who once stood for her father on crowded buses, offering their seats without fanfare, restoring some invisible dignity he'd been losing inch by inch. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Would you like to switch seats with me? I'm in 2A, first class." The man blinked, confused. "I what?" Claire didn't have a rehearsed answer. "It just looks like you might need the extra space and comfort more than I do today." The pause that followed was long and uncertain. She saw the battle behind his eyes, pride versus pain. Identity versus need. "I couldn't possibly," he murmured. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Claire said, holding out her boarding pass, "but I'd really like to." She expected him to smile, to nod, to thank her politely. Instead, for the briefest of moments, the mask cracked, the resignation slipped, and something else, something raw, appeared. Not gratitude exactly, recognition. Like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, really seen, and suddenly, achingly, remembered. His lips trembled as he took the ticket. "This is more kindness than I've experienced in quite some time," he said, almost like an apology. Claire felt the ache in his voice, not pity, something deeper. The weight of knowing how long it had been since someone treated him as something more than a walking wound. The gate agent's eyes widened when they approached together. "You're sure you want to give up your seat, ma'am?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "I'm sure?" Claire said firmly. The man said nothing. He just gripped the boarding pass like it might vanish if he loosened his fingers. As they parted, he toward the luxury of first class, she toward the back of the plane. They exchanged a glance. No words, no fanfare, just a quiet nod, a contract, unspoken but complete. Claire found her new seat, 38D, middle, narrow, no legroom. The teenage boy beside her was already playing video games without headphones. The elderly woman on the other side smiled kindly, then promptly fell asleep on Claire's shoulder. Claire sat in silence. Let the reality settle in. The fancy meal she had memorized? Gone. The champagne? Gone. The spacious cabin? Gone. But there was no regret, not yet. Hours passed. The lights dimmed. Dinner arrived. A rubbery tray of overcooked chicken and congealed vegetables. Claire chewed slowly, imagining what the meal up front must have looked like. She pushed the thought aside. At one point, she needed to use the restroom, and to get there, she had to pass through the first-class cabin. She saw him there, reclined, comfortable, a real glass of wine on the tray, a linen napkin folded in his lap. He turned, startled to see her, almost unsure if she was real or imagined. For a heartbeat, his eyes asked, "Are you okay? Do you want it back?" Claire smiled softly, gave a little wave, a silent reassurance. "No, I'm okay." The relief in his expression, real, unguarded, made every ache in her legs worth it. She returned to her cramped seat, curled slightly sideways to avoid waking the woman asleep on her. The teenager was now watching a movie, loudly. Claire closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she didn't imagine herself sipping champagne on a yacht or lounging at a private infinity pool. She thought instead about what dignity costs and what it gives, and somehow, for reasons she couldn't quite name, she felt rich. A week in Sydney passed like a breath. Claire danced at her sister's wedding, laughed with cousins she hadn't seen in years, wandered through the harbor with a coffee in hand and no itinerary to follow. She never mentioned the seat exchange. Not once. When Emily asked about the flight, Claire just smiled and said, "It was memorable." And it was, but not in the way she'd planned. When she returned home, her life slipped back into its usual rhythm. Coffee at 7, desk by 8, researching resorts in Portugal by 9. Her co-workers welcomed her back with hugs and photos from the wedding. Nobody asked about first class. Nobody knew. The memory of that burned man, of the look in his eyes, stayed with her like a quiet hum beneath the surface of her days. Occasionally, she wondered if he'd made it to Sydney safely, if the flight attendants had treated him well, if he'd gotten any rest. But mostly, she moved on, until exactly 3 weeks later, when the silence shattered. At 5:47 a.m., Claire woke to a sound she had never heard before. A low, rhythmic pounding, not thunder, not traffic. It grew louder, deeper, shaking the picture frames on her walls. For a wild moment, she thought it was an earthquake. But then she recognized it. The thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors. Not the kind used in traffic reports or medical emergencies. This was something different, heavier, deliberate, powerful. Heart racing, Claire stumbled to her window and pulled the curtain aside. What she saw didn't make sense. A massive white helicopter was descending toward the field of her modest home, flanked by security personnel, black SUVs, and what looked like Secret Service agents in suits and earpieces. On the side of the helicopter, in bold lettering, were the words, "United States of America." Claire froze. Her breath fogged the glass. Marine One, the helicopter used by the president. She blinked, certain she was dreaming, but the cold floor beneath her bare feet said otherwise. Down below, agents moved with practiced precision. Men in dress uniforms stood near the landing site. A crowd had already gathered at the edge of her street, neighbors peeking from porches, police setting up a perimeter. Claire looked around her living room, suddenly aware she was wearing her oldest pajamas, her hair a mess, and there were 3 coffee mugs on the kitchen table. She hadn't done the dishes last night. A plate with crumbs sat abandoned beside her laptop. What was happening? Then came the knock. 3 sharp, exact raps at the door. Official, unmistakable. She opened it, stunned. "Miss Jensen?" the man said, flashing credentials. "Secret Service. We apologize for the early arrival. You have visitors who would like to speak with you. Would you be able to get dressed within 15 minutes? Claire blinked. "Visitors? On Marine One?" The agent allowed himself a small smile. "If you would, ma'am, they'll explain everything shortly." 15 minutes later, dressed in the first thing she could grab, jeans and a sweater, Claire stepped out into the cool morning air, still unsure whether she was awake. As she walked down her driveway, she saw him. The man from the flight. But this time, not in civilian clothes. He wore a crisp, dark green army dress uniform, adorned with medals and insignia that shimmered in the early light. His cap shadowed part of his face, but the burn scars were still unmistakable. Her heart leapt. He stepped forward, extended a hand. "Miss Jensen," he said with quiet gravity. "I'm Colonel Daniel Ross, United States Army Special Forces. We met on a flight to Sydney, though I didn't properly introduce myself at the time." Claire took his hand, still speechless. "You're military?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I was traveling to Australia for a specialized burn treatment, part of a long recovery process after a mission that didn't go quite as planned." He paused, choosing his words. 3 years ago, my team was pinned down in a building under enemy fire. I managed to get them all out alive." He gestured casually to his scarred face. "But I paid a price." Claire swallowed hard. "You saved them." He nodded once. "Worth it. Every single one made it home." Then he gestured toward the helicopter. "I know this is overwhelming, but I wanted to thank you personally." Claire shook her head, still trying to grasp what was happening. This is too much. I just gave you a seat." Colonel Ross smiled, a flicker of emotion in his expression. "No, Miss Jensen. You reminded me I was still a person, not just a uniform, not just a set of scars." He looked toward the helicopter. And it turns out someone else heard that story too. The wind from the helicopter's rotors had died down, but Claire's thoughts were still caught in a storm. Colonel Daniel Ross, the man she had offered her seat to, now stood before her not as a quiet stranger, but as a decorated military officer, flanked by security and purpose. The medals on his chest glittered in the rising sun, and Claire had the strange out-of-body sensation of watching her own life from afar. "I told your story," he said, his voice steady. 3 days after I returned from Australia, I was awarded the Medal of Honor at the White House. During my speech, I mentioned you. Claire's breath caught. "The Medal of Honor?" He nodded. "It's the highest military decoration. I didn't plan to share much about the flight, but when I got up there, I realized the story wasn't complete without you." Claire stared at him, stunned. "You talked about me? To the President?" "To the President, the First Lady, the Joint Chiefs, everyone." His voice was calm, but there was a reverence beneath it, the kind of gravity that made even ordinary words feel sacred. "I told them about the woman who gave up her first-class seat to a burned stranger without asking for anything in return, about how that moment reminded me that I was more than what war had left behind." He paused, looking out over the neighborhood. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Claire's hands trembled. "I thought it would end there." He continued, "Just a mention, a quiet thank you, but something happened. After the ceremony, the First Lady approached me. She said your story moved her, that in a room full of medals and uniforms, the most powerful gesture came from someone without either." Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "But I'm just a travel agent." Colonel Ross shook his head. "You're someone who gave dignity when no one else did. And in our line of work, military, government, leadership, that means more than we often admit." He gestured to the helicopter behind him. "She had an idea, and when she heard you'd never flown first class before, that you've spent your life sending others on dream vacations you never took yourself, she said, and I quote, 'Let's change that.'" Claire blinked, overwhelmed. "So this isn't just a visit?" "No, ma'am. This is the beginning of your thank you." They boarded Marine One together. Inside, Claire felt the quiet hum of power and protocol. Leather seats, polished wood, and a crew that treated her with the same respect they would offer to any official passenger. Colonel Ross sat across from her, calm as ever, as the helicopter lifted into the sky. "Where are we going?" she asked, still in disbelief. "Andrews Air Force Base," he replied. "That's just the first stop." From there, Claire was escorted directly to a C-37A military jet, a Gulfstream usually reserved for top-ranking officials. Its interior rivaled any luxury private aircraft she'd ever seen in travel brochures. She ran her hand over the smooth table, still processing. "I don't understand," she murmured. "All this because I gave up a seat?" "No," Ross said gently, "because you saw me. You treated me like a human being, not a set of injuries, and that, Claire, is rare." The flight didn't go to Washington or some media event. It went to Hawaii. Specifically, Hale Koa, a luxury resort on Waikiki Beach reserved for military families. Claire was booked into the suite normally kept for visiting dignitaries, the same suite generals and ambassadors stayed in. Every detail had been arranged. Private helicopter tours over classified military sites, a sunset cruise through restricted waters at Pearl Harbor, access to beaches no civilian had ever stepped on. It wasn't just a vacation, it was an honor. On the second day, a Navy captain guided her aboard a military vessel for a private tour of Pearl Harbor. "Usually, only diplomats get this view," he said as they pulled away from the docks. "Colonel Ross asked us to make an exception." Claire looked at him, her voice quiet. "Why is everyone being so kind?" The captain smiled. "Colonel Ross is a legend. After his injuries, he disappeared from public life, wouldn't take interviews, refused award ceremonies. But after he met you, something changed. He started showing up again, not just physically, emotionally. He looked toward the horizon. You didn't just give him a seat. You gave him back a part of himself. Later that week, Claire experienced her first ever helicopter tour, this time flying with military pilots over parts of the island untouched by tourism. As they soared above a dense green ridge, the pilot turned in his seat and said through the headset, "Colonel Ross wanted you to see this next spot. It's not on any maps." They cleared the ridge, and Claire gasped. A cascading waterfall emptied into a crystal blue lagoon, surrounded by untouched rainforest. No roads, no trails, just beauty, raw and sacred. He came here after his final surgery, the pilot said it reminded him what he was fighting for. Claire pressed her fingers to the window. The lump in her throat wasn't sadness, it was awe. That evening, as the sun dipped into the Pacific, Claire sat at a quiet table set up on a private beach. Colonel Ross arrived in civilian clothes, polo shirt, slacks, more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said as they watched the horizon blush with color. "My treatment in Australia, it worked, better than expected. I have one final procedure next month." "That's wonderful," Claire said sincerely. He nodded, looking out over the ocean. "Last time, I was dreading the flight. This time, I've booked 2 first-class tickets." He turned to her. "The second is for you, if you'd come with me." Claire blinked. "Me? You're the one who helped me get there the first time," he said, "and sometimes that matters more than blood or rank." Claire looked out at the waves, thought about everything that had unfolded, all because of a quiet choice at a crowded gate. She nodded. "I'd be honored." Claire Jensen had spent most of her life sending other people on trips they'd never forget. Now, for the first time, she was the story. Each morning in Hawaii began with a quiet knock on the suite door. Not from housekeeping, but from military officers sent to escort her to that day's experience. No brochures, no upsells, just a quiet dignity in the way they treated her. A respect she wasn't used to. She was given access to parts of the island even locals didn't know existed. Military conservation sites, radar stations hidden in dense forests, and beaches untouched by any human footprint. What had once been pixels on a client's screen had become places she now stood barefoot upon, sand between her toes, waves brushing against ankles, not used to luxury. She thought she'd feel like an outsider. Instead, she felt seen. On the third day, a Marine officer handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from the First Lady. "Miss Jensen, your simple act of compassion reminds us what this country is built on. Not just courage in combat, but quiet courage in ordinary places. Thank you for reminding us all. With respect, the First Lady of the United States." Claire sat still for a long moment, staring at the neat cursive. She thought of her tiny desk at Elysian Travel, the postcards pinned to her cubicle, the leftover coffee, the brochures curling at the edges. That was still her real life. And yet, this moment belonged to her too. One afternoon, as she returned from a tour of a naval communications hub, she found a new message waiting in her suite. It was from Colonel Ross. "Meet me just before sunset. Beachside. No uniform this time." She walked across the soft sand, barefooted and unsure. He was already there, leaning against a driftwood log, sleeves rolled, cap off. This time, the scars on his face were more visible, and somehow less noticeable. He looked up and smiled, not with obligation, not with performance, but the kind of smile that said, "You changed something." "I never liked ceremonies," he said as she sat beside him. "Never liked being saluted. After I got injured, I stopped showing up. Too many eyes, too many people flinching." Claire said nothing. She just listened. "And then on that plane," he continued, "you looked at me like I was normal, not invisible, not a symbol, just a guy with bad luck and a long flight ahead." He turned to her. "That seat you gave up? It helped me sleep for the first time in weeks. It gave me enough rest to face that treatment in Sydney. It reminded me I wasn't broken beyond repair." He paused, letting the waves carry his silence. "And here's the thing, Claire. Most people think heroism is loud. Explosions, headlines, statues. But that's not how healing works. Healing is quiet. Slow. It starts when someone does the right thing when no one's watching." Claire looked down at the sand. "I wasn't trying to be heroic. Exactly, Ross said. That's why it mattered. They sat in silence for a while. The sun dipped lower. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a small velvet box. Don't worry, he said with a half smile. Not that kind of box. Inside was a coin, etched on one side with the emblem of the U.S. Army Special Forces. The other side bore the Latin motto, De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. This is a challenge coin, he said. We don't give them out lightly. We trade them in the field, in moments when words aren't enough. He handed it to her. No one's ever received one from me who wasn't wearing a uniform, until now. Claire held the coin like it was made of glass. I don't know what to say. You already said it, he replied. 3 weeks ago, without opening your mouth. That night, back in her suite, Claire placed the coin beside the First Lady's note. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because something deeper than tears had taken root. A quiet pride, a restored sense of self. On her final day, the base commander offered her a private farewell lunch at the officers' club. Between toasts and handshakes, one of the younger officers leaned over and said, "Ma'am, just so you know, Colonel Ross doesn't do this. He doesn't bring civilians into his circle." Claire smiled, touched. "I'm not sure I belong in it." The officer tilted his head. "Ma'am, you're not in his circle. You're part of his story." When the military flight brought Claire Jensen back home, the neighborhood looked just as she'd left it. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, a dog barking at the mailman. But Claire had changed. Not in the way people might expect. There were no press cameras waiting, no parade, no headlines. Just the soft crunch of gravel under her shoes, and the key she still used to open the same old door. But inside her modest house, on the kitchen table where she once planned client itineraries and drank coffee from chipped mugs, there was now a small package waiting. No return address. Inside, a model of Marine One carefully detailed, and a handwritten note. Some people spend their lives collecting luxury. Others, like you, collect moments of kindness. Thank you for reminding me which one matters more. Daniel. Claire placed the model on her desk at Elysian Travel, right beside the postcards from places she used to only dream about. Now, when clients asked about it, she smiled and told them a story. Not about a resort, not about a yacht, but about a burned stranger on a plane and how giving up a seat changed both their lives. And people listened. They always listened. Weeks passed, then months. One afternoon, a new trainee at the agency was struggling with a demanding client. Claire leaned over and whispered, "Listen closely. What they want isn't just the trip. It's the feeling of being seen." The trainee blinked. "Like, heard?" "No," Claire said. "Seen. Deep down. The way people hope the world will notice them." She smiled gently. "That's where the real value is." Claire still lived in the same house, still ate leftover pasta on Thursdays, still browsed flight deals even when she wasn't going anywhere. But something had shifted, because now, when she helped others chase their dreams, she did it knowing she hadn't just given them what she never had. She had lived something few ever would. A moment of quiet courage, a glimpse of unexpected grace, a reminder that kindness when no one's watching is what dignity is made of. Maybe you've never saved a life. Maybe no one's ever called you a hero, but one quiet act, given freely, without witnesses, can change someone's entire path. And sometimes, that's more powerful than any medal. Type 1 if you've ever been judged by how you looked and wished someone would just see you. Type 2 if you believe that kindness, even in silence, is what makes us human. And if stories like this mean something to you, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started.